Numbers 6, words 24 to 25. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The passage is more than just a blessing, it encapsulates God's character, his relationship with his people, and the spiritual atmosphere he desires for his people to live in. Before understanding the individual elements of the blessing, it is essential to grasp the context in which this prayer is given. This passage is part of a larger section in Numbers 6 that includes the Nazirite vow and concludes with this priestly blessing. In Numbers 6, words 22 to 23, God tells Moses to instruct Aaron, the high priest, and his sons to bless the Israelites with this prayer. It is a direct command from God to his priests on how they are to pronounce a blessing over the people. This means that this blessing is not a mere wish or an expression of good intentions, it is an authoritative declaration, an act of intercession by the priests on behalf of the people of Israel. The fact that the blessing comes from God through his appointed priests emphasizes that this is not an ordinary blessing, but one that carries the weight of divine authority and promise. The Lord bless you and keep you. Bless you. The Hebrew word for bless here is barak, which means to confer goodness or prosperity upon someone. In a biblical context, it often carries the connotation of divine favor. This blessing is not about material wealth alone, but about a comprehensive kind of prosperity, spiritual, emotional, relational, and physical. Blessing in the Bible is closely tied to God's covenant with his people. When God blesses someone, he is actively pouring out his goodness on them, ensuring their well-being in every area of life. It's a favor that goes beyond human efforts, making it clear that the blessing comes from God's sovereign will. Keep you. The word keep means to guard, protect, and preserve. It's a deep, relational form of care, akin to a shepherd carefully guarding his sheep. This is an assurance of God's protection physically, spiritually, and emotionally. God promises to not only watch over the people of Israel, but also to prevent harm from reaching them, ensuring that they remain safe under his watchful eye. This opening line of the blessing reveals God's role as a protector and provider. It reflects the relationship between God and his people. He is the one who gives them security and sustains their lives. This has implications not just for their immediate safety but also for their ultimate well-being in the broader sense. The Lord make his face shine upon you, verse 25. The phrase make his face shine is rich with meaning in the Bible. It appears often as a metaphor for God's favor and personal presence. The face of God. In the ancient Hebrew worldview, the face symbolized a person's very presence, character, and will. To have the face of God turned toward someone means that God is present with them, watching over them, and actively engaged in their lives. In contrast, when God hides his face, it symbolizes his withdrawal of favor or attention. Shining face. The idea of God's face shining upon his people suggests joy, approval, and blessing. The imagery of shining conveys the radiance that comes from the presence of God. Just as the sun radiates warmth and light, so God's face shining on someone brings peace, joy, and favor. This is an image of intimacy. God's face shining upon his people signifies a closeness and a personal relationship. It reflects the deep desire of God to be near his people, not distant or aloof. The people are being invited into God's presence in a way that is warm, welcoming, and full of grace. And be gracious to you, verse 25. Gracious. The word for grace here is chanan, which means to show favor, mercy, or compassion. Grace refers to God's unmerited favor. He gives of himself freely, not because of any obligation or merit on the part of the recipient, but because of his love and compassion. This is the essence of God's nature. He is gracious, meaning he extends forgiveness, kindness, and mercy without conditions. This grace is not only about giving material blessings but is especially seen in God's attitude toward his people despite their flaws and failings. Theological implications. Grace is the foundation of the covenantal relationship between God and Israel. Despite their disobedience or rebellion, God continues to show mercy, granting them his favor. In the New Testament, this grace is fully revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, who embodies the grace of God in his life, death, and resurrection. The grace spoken of in this blessing foreshadows the grace that would be made fully known to the world through Christ. A story of blessing and protection. Once upon a time, in the ancient land of Israel, there was a vast and wandering nation, a people who had been rescued from slavery and brought into the wilderness by a mighty God. They had witnessed great miracles, the parting of the Red Sea, the provision of manna from heaven, and the thunderous presence of God on the mountain. Yet, despite these extraordinary events, they were a people who often felt vulnerable, uncertain, and afraid. They had been promised a land of their own, a land flowing with milk and honey, but the journey to that land was long, filled with obstacles, dangers, and challenges. It was a journey that could only be endured if they knew they were loved and protected by their God. In the center of the Israelite camp stood a tent, the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God. God was not a distant, unknowable figure, but one who dwelled among them. He had chosen to be their God, and they, His people. Yet, even though He was near, they often found themselves questioning His presence and His promises. They had their doubts. One day, after many months of wandering, the people gathered before Moses, the men God had chosen to lead them. They had seen Moses speak face to face with God, and his leadership had brought them through many struggles. Yet, Moses himself knew the burdens of leading a people who often doubted the goodness of God, despite His continuous acts of mercy. Moses stood before the people and, with a heavy heart, sought God for guidance. How could he reassure the people that God would never leave them? How could he speak into their fears and remind them of God's goodness and His promises? In response to Moses' prayers, God spoke to him with compassion and care. Moses, God said, "Tell Aaron, the high priest, to speak these words over the people of Israel. These words will remind them that I am with them, that I bless them, and that I will protect them no matter where they go." And so, God gave Moses a beautiful and powerful blessing, the priestly blessing, to be pronounced over the Israelites. The blessing. Moses called Aaron, the high priest, and his sons to stand before him. The people gathered around, some anxious, others hopeful, but all eager to hear what Moses had to say. Aaron raised his hands toward the people, and as his voice echoed across the camp, he spoke. "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you." As Aaron spoke these words, something extraordinary began to happen. The people felt a sense of peace, a warm reassurance that settled in their hearts. They were used to hearing words of judgment, of law, of commands, but this was different. This was a word of blessing, a word that promised care and protection, a word that declared that God would never leave them. For the first time in a long while, they felt the tangible, loving presence of God. The meaning of the blessing. As Aaron spoke, the people began to understand the depth of what was being said. Each phrase carried a profound meaning. "The Lord bless you and keep you." This wasn't just a wish for good fortune. It was God's personal desire to bestow His goodness upon them. To bless someone in the biblical sense meant to pour out favor upon them, physically, spiritually, emotionally. It meant provision, prosperity, and peace. And to keep them wasn't just a casual protection, it was a careful, loving guardianship. They were not left to wander alone, but under the constant watch of a loving Father. "The Lord make His face shine upon you." This phrase struck deep into their hearts. To have God's face shine upon them meant more than receiving His favor, it meant being in His presence. It was a declaration that God was not distant but near, that He saw them, knew them, and was pleased with them. To feel God's face shining upon them was to feel His love radiating toward them. The warmth of His smile could chase away their doubts and fears. They were His beloved people, and He delighted in them. "And be gracious to you." The word gracious was like a balm to their souls. God wasn't giving them this blessing because they had earned it, but because of His unmerited favor. It wasn't based on their performance or their ability to keep the law, but on God's infinite grace. No matter how many times they stumbled, no matter how many times they doubted, God would still be gracious to them. His mercy was greater than their failures. The impact of the blessing. As the words settled over the people, they felt something change. The uncertainty and anxiety that had plagued them began to lift. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling, it was as if they had been touched by the very presence of God. This blessing wasn't just something they heard, it was something they experienced. Children held their parents' hands a little tighter, comforted by the assurance of God's care. Parents whispered words of hope to their children, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were not alone. The priests, who had spoken the blessing, looked around at the faces of the people, knowing that these words were not just ritualistic phrases, they were a declaration of God's heart for His people. A lasting legacy. From that day on, the blessing of Numbers 6, words 24 to 25 became an integral part of Israel's worship and daily life. It was spoken over them in moments of joy and in moments of sorrow. Whenever the people felt lost or afraid, the priests would stand before them and pronounce this blessing. It was a reminder that God was not just a figure of distant power, but a loving Father who walked with His people, watched over them, and poured out His favor upon them. As generations passed, this blessing continued to be a part of their spiritual heritage. It was repeated at weddings, celebrations, and even in times of crisis. It became a central prayer in the Jewish faith, a timeless reminder of God's unchanging love. A blessing for us today. For us, too, these words hold power. The same God who blessed the Israelites is still with us today. His heart toward us is the same. He desires to bless us, to keep us, to make His face shine upon us, and to be gracious to us. Whether in times of joy or sorrow, these words remind us that we are never alone. We are under the care of a loving, gracious Father who is always near, always watching, and always pouring out His mercy. And in the most personal way, through the person of Jesus Christ, we see the fullness of this blessing. Christ is the ultimate expression of God's face shining upon us, His grace made manifest, His favor extended to all who believe. Just as the Israelites received this blessing with open hearts, so can we. God is with us, His favor is upon us, and His grace is always available. This is the true blessing, the deep, abiding presence of God with His people, today and forevermore. This story reminds us that Numbers 6:24-25 is not just a prayer, but a promise, one that continues to resonate in the hearts of all who seek the presence of God. It is an invitation to rest in His protection, His favor, and His grace, knowing that He is always with us.
This prayer is a profound expression of God's heart toward His people. It highlights several key elements of God's relationship with His followers. Protection and provision. The Lord promises to guard His people from harm and bless them with everything they need to thrive. Intimacy and favor. God desires to be near His people, to have His face shine upon them, reflecting His personal care, approval, and presence. Grace and mercy. Even though the Israelites and humanity in general fall short of God's perfect standards, He promises to be gracious, extending His favor and mercy without requiring anything in return. In the broader narrative of the Bible, Numbers 6:24-25 serves as a picture of the relationship God desires with His people. It is not a distant or impersonal relationship, but one marked by ongoing care, presence, and grace. This blessing reveals God's commitment to His people's well-being, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Application for today. Personal blessing. For modern-day believers, this blessing can be viewed as a reminder of God's continuous presence, protection, and favor. It affirms that God's desire for His people remains the same, to bless, keep, and be gracious to them. Prayer and worship. This passage is often used in worship settings, weddings, and significant life events as a reminder of God's enduring favor and presence. It is a prayer of hope and confidence that God's promises are still active today. God's unfailing love. This blessing reassures Christians of God's unwavering love and His grace that covers them, reminding them that they are never alone and are always under God's watchful care.